Faithful Exiles is a podcast that explores life following Jesus Christ in South Africa. We want to think deeply about what the Bible has to say about life and talk about what that might mean in the situations God has placed us in. The views and opinions expressed in this episode are not necessarily those held by the host, co-host, or production team. As this is a discussion and not a pure teaching platform, it is up to the listener to engage with the content responsibly.
Welcome to another episode of Faithful Exiles. What you're about to listen to is a discussion with theologian Dr. Krohn about Christianity and culture. Many Christians are confused about their role in culture and how to relate to politics. We hope this conversation will be a useful starting point for how to think about this critical topic. So Dr. James Krohn is a theological educator, former pastor, and the founder-director of CROWSE. He studied visual arts before moving on to focus on theology, first studying under Dr. Gerard in Canada, and later completing a doctor's in theology on Calvin's Trinitarian vision in Stellenbosch. He has served on the faculties of the Bible Institute of South Africa and George Whitfield College, and a seasonal lecturer at Regent College in Canada. He is married to Corley, and together with their 5 children, they are avid outdoor enthusiasts and adventurers. So welcome, Dr. James Krohn.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
I get to, in this interview, call you Dr. Krohn, and you can't complain about it, which is pretty cool.
I will be complaining about that.
Maybe afterwards. Well, I mean,
so it's just a comment there. It's not seasonal lecture; it's sessional lecture, because seasonal means like every summer or whatever. But sessional, never mind. Then nobody will pick it up.
I should be Googling that afterwards. Okay. Anyway, do you maybe want to tell us a bit about yourself, other than the bio?
Yeah, I'm married to Corley, and we have 5 children, and we were born, I was born here in Stellenbosch, so it's nice to be able to come back here after a lifetime of actually being away from Stellenbosch. And there are many reasons why we chose to come back to Stellenbosch, and we can maybe tease that out a little bit later. I don't know what else you need from me. I can't remember what I thought I should be saying at this particular point.
No, that's fine. So maybe we can start with what you just mentioned about your move here from Canada. So you served as a pastor in Canada for 5 years or so. And what inspired the move back to Stellenbosch?
Yeah, I mean, as in the Lord's economy, these things sort of come to you. You don't often get to choose what happens. My dad had passed away, and we had to kind of come back, return here. But it was an opportunity to really think and plan carefully that if we had like a blank sheet and the Lord gave us opportunity to do a ministry, what would that ministry look like? And so actually we had about a year of thinking and wrestling with what we could do, and then purposefully came back to Stellenbosch. Everything didn't quite work out as planned, but that was the idea, to come back here. So just to say then, the idea of CROWSE is that it's the basket, the conceptual basket that we decided to put the ministry in is a Christian study center, which I don't think is a familiar concept to South Africans, but very familiar to North Americans. So a Christian study center is sort of classically the idea in the vacation of evangelical and Bible-believing Christianity from the university campuses, even by means of its theological departments. Evangelical Christians have sought to reintroduce the gospel into the academic domain by means of a Christian study center. So it's a little bit advanced for South Africa, which has more traditional religious categories, but it creates a basket within which you can do the kind of things that we want to do. And so Christian study centers traditionally, you could also call it a Christian formation center, and there are many ways to come at it. But essentially what you are trying to do is introduce the Christian faith back into the world amongst all the other worldviews that are presented at a university context, and to basically say that the gospel can speak into all these different vocations, into all these different disciplines, and it's necessary for there to be a Christian presentation of the truth in amongst all these other truths. So it's a very biblical instinct, I think. This is what Paul did when he went to the marketplace and reasoned with people. And so I think there's a very good instinct. And besides all the very good work done by various churches by means of campus organizations, it's good to have something like this. Now, whether we actually function like that or actually have accomplished our goal is we don't really know yet, but that's the attempt. There's a second reason why I was particularly interested in that, and that is that so CROWSE as a Christian Study Center has particular distinctives. You can ask me about that in a moment, perhaps, but one of the key things for us, having been in university Christian ministry personally and really enjoying it, and then also having been as a practice as a theology lecturer in a theological college context, I felt that there was something amiss with both of them. So I felt that that being in Christian university ministry, there really wasn't much in the line of deep theological discipleship. It's almost like you just teach people the basics and you move on. There's no real wrestling with the scriptures. And there's no real worldview transformation that often comes along with that, unless it's a very particular kind of Christian ministry on campus. But for the most part, you disciple someone into a church subculture. And then, so that's a crisis, I think. It's a real crisis. It's a crisis for all those people who are going into different vocations, not really understanding the faith. And then I think, on the other hand, having taught at a theological college, there's a real lack of engagement with culture. And all these things we move into the church. So you move pastors who don't have deep capacity to deal with cultural issues or worldview issues or disciplines, or sometimes they're incapable of connecting with the people in their congregation who actually kind of work for an honest living, type of idea. And on the other hand, you then populate the church with a whole lot of people who just kind of sit somewhere at the feet of whatever is given them without really engaging. And so what we're really doing is we're defrauding the church of what the church can be in society. So those were the kind of ideas that fed into what we are trying to do. And CROWSE in this Christian Study Center has a particular flavor by means of its own distinctives, or distinctive.
Yeah, so on your website, crux.africa, so I would encourage everyone to go check it out. That's krux.africa. Under the About section for CROWSE, you say that our mission is best described as theological discipleship, a form of discipleship that seeks to bring both thought and behavior under the lordship of Christ. Primarily, this means gaining a deeper understanding of God's great act toward us in Christ, and therefore the consequences of the gospel for all of human endeavor. We believe this can only truly be done in community through the fellowship of the Holy Spirit and is expressed by means of study, mentorship, practical hospitality, and engaging with the arts. So, I mean, already you have quite a few of the distinctives lined out there. So I don't know if you want to expand on some of them.
Yeah, maybe a little bit. I think sort of CROWSE stands on four legs, and they're all really important for us. I mean, we've had in our own Christian lives, we've walked a particular road. I think the Lord is good to us in this sense that you sort of go on a journey, and God shapes you, and He brings you to a place where you feel, okay, here is a place where I can make a contribution, or like Bjerknes said, where the world's great needs and your great desires, the place where those meet. And for us, that's always been in this university domain, but in a particular way. And so there's obviously a lot of academic debate about what is this as a parachurch ministry, is this a church or what, because obviously we establish a little community. It's a little community of faith thinking, of faith learning. And so I have a little curriculum that I sort of have in my mind. This is what any person needs to understand about the Bible and about God and the world in order to negotiate a successful Christian life, or a fruitful, thank you, a flourishing Christian life. And so, but alongside that, we have it's practice from within a community and around hospitality, and a lot of mentorship goes into this. And then there's a particular reason why we've chosen culture and the arts as something that would be a distinctive. And I think that's pretty key to what we've accomplished thus far. Not only because I have very enthusiastic people in that area, but also because I think the discussion around Christianity and public theology has changed significantly in terms of people's accessibility or the way that they access the Christian faith.
So if you had to perhaps expand a bit on things that you mentioned about like university context, and I know like also the connections with Labrie and so forth, like why are those things kind of so critical for you?
I think Labrie is critical because it's a community of faith thinking and deeply trying to discern where culture is. I mean, I think Francis Schaeffer was, in spite of some criticism against him, he was prophetic in many ways. And the legacy of his influence is incredible. I mean, the amount of people who've come through Labrie who are actually critical and key thinkers in the worldwide evangelical world is surprising. Actually, you'll be surprised who was shaped at Labrie. Let me speak to the arts, and so culture is a complicated thing, and we can talk about culture in a moment because it's a very very complex concept to deal with, and to find some handle on that is hard enough. But let me speak to the arts because I think that's a little bit easier for people to do that. For example, we run an annual artists gathering for Christian artists, which I would, without a doubt, is the most flourishing part of our work, not least because we have some incredibly enthusiastic people.
I think the one you did this year got quite a bit of international attention, right?
That's right. Yeah. We've managed to attract some of the best speakers in the world, and it's always... What's really surprising is you've got some of these people overseas, and you know, as South Africans, we have this great admiration for people on the other side of the ocean. You know, I think they're amazing, and they go like, "Wow, you guys are amazing. Could I resign and come and work for you?" And I'm like, "What? You know what?" So somehow we've managed to put our finger on something, and I think. And we're not the only people. There's been a renaissance in the Christian world around the arts. And it's a good thing because out of the reformational Christian worldview grew an initial encompassing of the world as a theatre of God's glory, and the arts being expressive of that, particularly, for example, 17th century Dutch art, and so there's a great legacy, but that kind of took a bit of a nosedive when you get to the 18th and the 19th centuries, and in the sort of latter part of the 20th century, and Schaeffer had a lot to do with that, there was a revival of interest in Christianity in the arts. And it's timely because in, for example, classical education, that you had this classic triad of the truth, what is truthful, what is good, and what is beautiful. So truth, goodness, and beauty sort of form this triad, which is sort of the goal of your educational or your cultivating enterprise in humanity. And beauty often comes third in the line. So you start with that which is true, then you go to the good, and then you go to the beautiful. And in postmodern times, and in the great changes that has happened in Western society and actually worldwide society, to just punt the truth has been, people view that as abrasive or confrontational. And so often what you've seen this slow transition of evangelical churches, let's move to the good. Okay, so let's explain the gospel, but we don't use words. So let's do social action and that kind of thing. And so there's sort of been this transition to what is the good in the society. And you see that in worldwide movements, you know, what's good for the city is good for the gospel and that kind of thing.
Kind of like a practical approach to theology.
Yeah, particularly in terms of social justice and outreach and that kind of thing. And of course, the more conservative evangelicals have tried to resist that quite heavily and try to sort of, you know, what's the gap between these two things? Is it one or the other? And do you lose one when you have the other? And we've been debating this endlessly, while a lot of people have simply moved on to the third of those legs, and that is the imaginative, and have realized that in the domain of what is classically called beauty, which of course is a very contested concept, but just keep it in the sort of the common linguistic framework of that which is aesthetically pleasing or tickles the imagination. That's gained incredible traction in the kind of culture that we live in. And so it's a little bit saying to someone, you know, soccer is a good game, or, you know, soccer is a game that you play in this particular way. And this is good that soccer has this sort of social matrix, and this is what soccer could do for the world, as opposed to taking someone and saying, is it not the beautiful game? Will you fall in love with the game, and will that not drive you? And so people have realized that particularly in recent times, that the imaginative and the beautiful can sort of some theologians would say, well, we try and reach the heart and then let the heart persuade the mind again of what is true. So there's people resonate with that, which is beautiful. And so it is amazing the power the arts has, for example, in regaining or reframing the Christian mind, for example. Okay. So I don't want to say too much more about that. Yeah.
Can I also just maybe throw something in there? I mean, I also think in terms of shaping the culture and what's shaping people is very much, it's not those didactic lectures. It's the Netflix. It's the the artistic books, the novels, the movies, the Netflix series. Those are what's really shaping people. And if Christians are removed from that space, there's a vacuum where other worldviews come in.
Yeah, and I mean that applies to the church very much. And so the churches in South Africa, the evangelical churches, are quite anemic to the arts. And often the best of our churches are anemic to the actual nature of the scriptures. It's prose and it's poetic and it's poetry and the way that the narrative itself comes across to us. So we've been massively reductionistic in this, and no wonder people have walked away from the institutionalized church.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the difficulty is that, like, especially like the reformers, it's probably something you taught me, but like there's like that emphasis on the ear as opposed to the eye, the hearing. And I'm reminded also as you're speaking of like Calvin's Institutes, where he speaks of our inclination towards superstition and imagining God in, in the way that we would like to,
Yeah, Calvin used to say that the heart is a veritable idol factory, and so, but it's interesting. Okay, so this is a good question that you've really. It's a better question than you realize that you've asked, because a lot of people look at the Protestant imagination and they say, well, the Protestant imagination, there is none. Okay, the problem with the Protestant imagination is that there is none. And of course, that's not true. And so this is a contested area. And in recent times, historical Roman Catholicism has actually taken over the territory by means of its exploitation of this vacancy the vacancy of the imagination within the Protestant world. But of course, it's not entirely true. As you exactly pointed out, is that hearing then becomes the primary instrument of the imagination. And so in the Protestant era, in spite of the austerity of removing idolatrous artworks, where people looked visually in order to be informed of what they ought to think internally, they created actually an imagination of narrative, like in a new kind of shape that's a word-centered spirituality, which is deeply transforming and has great visual consequences. So that's a deep question. That's a really deep question, and it's a significant question because there is such a thing as the Protestant imagination. And the Protestant imagination is absolutely beautiful. And so we need to come back and rescue what is, in a sense, the legacy of scripture reading. You see it, for example, in just to give you one illustration, if you look at Eugene Peterson's book, The Message, right? I mean, Eugene Peterson's translation of the Bible, his book.
I would say that's more accurate than his Bible translation.
Yeah, but if you look at the, like, so for example, Bono, you too would say, well, if it weren't for Eugene Peterson, we'd have no inspiration to be actually returning to the scriptures and singing out of the depth of the Christian faith. And so Peterson did more than just write a paraphrase. He actually tried to recapture what is in the language, some of the poetic and the imaginative, the metaphor that's in the language, in contemporary idiom. And that's actually a magnificent task, whether you like the message or not.
Yeah, and I remember doing Romans 6, and you're using like the guy going to a different country as opposed to the death and baptism.
Yeah. But there's a great example of the Protestant imagination. And if you were to measure the effect of the message, if there was a measurable instrument by which you could determine that, you'd actually find it's been hugely effective. Yeah.
So I mean, we've been discussing the arts now, and also CROWSE and kind of its engagement with culture.
Yeah.
So how would you define culture for perhaps the viewer that maybe has something of a nebulous concept?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a notoriously difficult word to try and define or explain. I mean, it is said that in English, but I suppose it's the same for all languages, that the two most difficult words to explain are nature and culture, right? But I think therein also lies something of a clue of how to actually understand it. If nature is what God has made with the world, then culture is what we have made of the world. And I think, so Ken Myers, even if you've never read this, in the late 20th century, he wrote a little book called All God's Children and Blue Suede Shoes. Don't be tricked by the title. It's a magnificent bit of thinking. And so Ken Myers basically defines culture, and many since him have done that. If you're really looking for the most simplest definition, it's what we make of the world, and both materially and in terms of what is metaphysical, and in other words, both with what we make and the meaning that we make of the world. Sorry, metaphysical is probably not the right word, but
I was thinking like Jürgen's going to yell at someone any second now.
Yeah, okay. Transcendental. No, I don't mean that actually. I mean, I don't want to. I actually want to give you the most simplest definition of culture.
No, metaphysical is fine.
Yeah. So Ken Myers basically states then culture is what we make of the world, and I think it's great, both materially, all our artifacts, cultural artifacts, from the big things to the small things, right? And we sit surrounded by cultural artifacts here, but also all the meaning we make, and that is meaning from public policy to great works of art and literature and so on. And that's really, I think, the simplest way to get at it. And that's actually also the way that the Latin word culture operates. I mean, it's a gardening word, right? It comes right out of the early chapters of Genesis. We what God has given us, we are mandated to kind of cultivate the land, and so it takes on culture. Then takes on, I think, this kind of dangerous, complex, or I suppose slightly controversial meaning, especially in our context. Are you a cultured person? And that's a later meaning. That's sort of a post-Enlightenment view of culture, where you begin to say, well, are you a cultured person? I.e., have you done, do you understand something of classical music and so on? And herein lies, so we kind of have these distinctions between high and low culture, and we complicate this issue. But in reality, culture, in the most contemporary sense of the word, is really everything humans do in order to fabricate meaning of their lives. James Huntington, what is James Davis Huntington? What is his name, JP? James
Davison Hunter.
James Davison Hunter, yeah.
You have the same name, you can't remember his name.
Yeah, he is. He says it's the way we define reality. So lots more to say about this, obviously, because culture then also is a form of identity creating or identity making. Actually, let me just take one step back in the sense that the way that we often talk about human beings anthropologically would be to say we are Homo sapiens. And of course there's a reason why we go to that kind of definition of humanity. But there's a more basic definition of humanity, and that's Homo faber, the people who make things and have been mandated to make something of it. And if you go to a wonderful Christian artist in North America by the name of Makoto Fujimura, he'd say essentially human beings are Homo faber. We make things, and in that making of things, there is either a treacherous path before us or a flourishing path before us. In other words, we inevitably make things, and we see by what we've made, culture has changed. So culture is a very dynamic concept. There's also the idea of culture within culture, or subcultures, and subculture and culture also creates identity for us. But in the most basic way, I think, just to put the picture back into perspective, God made the world. God is a creator. We are his image bearers, and as image bearers, we are, in a sense, then after creators. We are makers, and the question is, what are we making of the world? And I think that's a much more helpful way to get at it.
Something that strikes me that you mentioned is the kind of lack of churches to often engage with culture, and therefore the focus of CROWSE to kind of maybe fill that void a bit.
Yes.
Why do you think it is that Christian churches often neglect engaging culture when it seems, I would imagine that if you started a church now, you would do the church in such a way where you do engage with culture. So it's
well, can I challenge that idea a little bit? I mean, I don't think it's the fact that churches don't engage culture; it's that they don't realize that they are engaging culture at every step. So culture is something inevitable. It's both reflective and reflexive, right? We analyze it and we engage with it, but it also shapes us. And so every church has a church culture, and it's a little bit like saying, every Christian is a theologian. Some people don't like that idea, but Theos and Logos, everyone talks and thinks about God. In the same way, every human being in that sense is, even if you're an atheist, you are a theologian, right? Because you know which God you don't want to believe in. So you are shaping that conversation around that. And in the same way, we're all engaging in culture. And the only problem is we don't do it in a thoughtful manner. And so my big gripe with evangelical subculture is that the way that it positions itself is often against the culture or transformative of culture, but it doesn't realize how much it actually represents the culture that it's in, which is not a Christian culture. So often in the churches that are most evangelistic, they're also most compromised at the level of actually working with cultural norms and assumptions that are actually not gospel assumptions. Yeah.
I think also often underlying there, from my perspective, is also a theological position that doesn't see any common grace in culture.
Yeah.
Like you say, culture is largely negative, and yet culture always has that dual aspect. I think, like you were saying earlier, it's the product of people created in the image of God. So there's elements of goodness, beauty, and truth. But there's also always that distorted element because of sin as well. But yeah, I think that there's often an underlying lack of recognition of common grace. And perhaps certain biblical themes might be overemphasized. And maybe that's one of the causes I see.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think what you've just said would be the most important thing to really tell Christians about culture. So obviously what Christians are trying to do in terms of culture, I mean, there's some classic ways of looking at culture and how we come to culture, and we can talk about that as well. There are different typologies or ways in which we approach culture. But the greatest problem for most Christians coming to culture is that they don't have that basic framework in place. So they don't realize that culture, in a sense, is a mixed bag. Or rather, put it this way, they think primarily in terms of transformational models. And then you begin to think, okay, if this is a Christian culture, how would God then... So Christian culture would basically be, if you were to use that kind of language, which can be sketchy, is to say that if God was managing the world, or for us to manage the world in God's way, how would human beings flourish? Now, that would be sort of a Christian cultural enterprise. But as you rightly pointed out, the major problem with that is that two things. First of all, that even though we are image bearers of God, and even though we are redeemed, and there's a sense in which we have been remade or being remade into the image of Jesus, we are still this side of the return of Christ. So some of our best Christian cultural artifacts or enterprises are horribly flawed. And you don't have to look much further than the concept of what is Christian art. I mean, what is Christian art? I mean, that's probably one of the best questions you can ask, because the answer to that determines everything, And then on the other hand is then to look at any other form of culture, if it's not made by a Christian or they're not Christians, to say, well, there's nothing good in it. And as if to say that other people who are not redeemed, who are not believers in Jesus, that they can't make anything good. And so one of the things you most often will hear in our conversations is when we meet together on a Thursday night and we have conversations around culture and philosophy and all sorts of things, is often the examples of the most Christian works would actually be done by people who are not Christian. Okay, and so within our secular culture, there is still this haunting of the transcendent, and is where you find some of the best artists in the world that the world they're very keen on actually are producing works of profound significance and meaning, which is really a search for meaning in a sense after God. And so it's that very mixed nature of culture that really throws us, right? So Christians can make really bad really bad makers of Christian culture, often, and sometimes people who are very far from the gospel are often very good culture makers. And so we need to be able to embrace it in that way and actually have the discernment to be able to see it like that.
So what would you say would be like some of the main distinctives in how Christians ought to view culture versus unbelievers? So you have both made in the image of God, the one, both distorted, the one being redeemed.
Yeah.
Both of them are going about the business of making the world in a certain way. So how should they differ in their approaches?
Yeah, I mean, that's so let me take you then to someone like Richard Niebuhr, who in around about 1950-51, I think he wrote a book called Christ and Culture, which has been a classic, as some of the other books that he's written. He was a New Orthodox theologian in North America, and he wrote what is sort of a historical analysis of how Christians have engaged with culture. And he comes up with a typology of 5 different types of ways in which Christ interacts with culture. And those are still with us. Well, the typology is still very useful, and it's a little bit complex to explain all of them. But I'll give you a little bit of a synopsis, and then maybe we can interact with that. So on the extremes, he has a version where there's a reading of history where Christ is always, or the gospel is always, at loggerheads and confrontation with the culture, and that human history is to be understood as that sort of flashpoint between the two. Which would negate, in a sense, everything we've said right now, a few minutes ago. And on the other hand, on the other extreme, you'd have the sense in which the goal of history itself, Christ is sort of subsumed into this history, which then takes away the very nature of the gospel and everything else we read in the Bible in terms of that challenge of creation redeemed, right? And then in the middle, you've got sort of 3 very useful ways in which he then goes to explain, which I suppose are more middle of the road ones. And one is sort of where Christ is above culture, and that sort of subsumes the large part of history where, for example, you're dealing with a pre-Enlightenment world where the epistemology, the authority, the knowledge, the root of knowledge is always by means of the church. And so Christ is sort of supreme. He's above culture, and yet subsumes every culture, but he's above it. And that is a notion particularly taken up by someone like Thomas Aquinas. And if I suppose a classic example would be any pope at any particular time trying to make a pronouncement on something in the world as if there's an authority that supersedes everything else. And classically debunked at the end of the Second World War. Just to give you one beautiful anecdote, when all the Allied forces were sitting with Stalin trying to remap Europe, the Pope was invited to the conversation. And sort of the Pope subtly turned to sort of the Russian delegates and say, well, I would like to suggest that we cut Europe like this. And then Stalin sort of looked over and said, and tell me, how many stormtroopers do you have? Sort of your classic confrontation of that, okay, you're operating from a model that's no longer existing in the modern world, right? And then your other 2 models are quite interesting. There's the one in which there's a paradox between Christ and culture. It's sort of the idea of there's 2 kingdoms, and it's difficult to interpret. We're both in the world, but not of the world. And it's difficult to exactly analyze where we stand at this particular way. And so there's a large debate around which sphere is this and what is its domain and what's the other domain. And there's a sort of a paradoxical relationship between the 2. And we recognize that to be true. And then I think the most common view is common amongst sort of contemporary evangelicalism and often pietism is one. Actually, there are other models into which sort of this pietism can fit in as well. I'll give you a few examples in a moment. But there's the idea that Christ is transformative of culture, sort of a conversionist model. Okay, and I think most evangelicals identify with that one. And so if you had to, most of us when we read Niebuhr's book, is like, oh yeah, that's my model, that's my typology. And then someone like Andy Croutch would say, you really need to think again. This is way above your pay grade. Like, you don't have the power to transform culture. This is not within your mandate of power and ability. And I like that. And so the reality is that there's something good actually in all of these models. There's something valid and true in all of them, at least in terms of Christ and his kingdom and God and what he does with the world. Some of them are a little bit more closer to the center for us than others. I think Keller uses a simpler model. He would say there's a sort of the worldview-ish confrontationist model. I mean, the Christian worldview would then interact with what is it called a secular worldview, and you need to. It's the world of ideas and the world of truth, and the gospel being preached into the world. So that's one model, and then there's the model that's a little bit more sort of social justice. You know, that the key things that we need to do, you'll see there's sort of lines of connecting with everything that we've said that come together with this. You know, the idea of social justice and doing good and good to the poor and so on. And often those are your conservative churches first, and then your more liberal churches. And great leaders in church history for all these things, necessary people. And then there's the model that basically separates these kingdoms entirely, or these domains entirely, which is an isolationist model. And then you're looking at classically people like the Amish, or brilliant scholars like Stanley Harvas and so on, where the Christian community withdraws from society and say, well, this is actually how we interact with the world. So as you're listening to all this, you realize that this stuff is actually very, very important. It's very, very important for pastors, for Christian evangelists, for missionaries, particularly if you're a missional church, to understand the complexity of what we're dealing with here. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's fascinating. And it's so complex, as like you mentioned, because like one starts talking about these things and you realize like we're kind of talking about eschatology now as well. Like, what view of the millennium do you hold, and
Yes,
which one works with my model?
Exactly. That's so true. I mean, you could actually go plot all these out on a page, and you can draw lines between these different things, you know. Like Jim Packer always used to say, it's a single ball of wax, my boy. You know, it's all together, you know, we need to flesh it out, you know, pull out the little thing, start on this side, you know, but it's all hangs together. And all of it hangs together, ironically, around a doctrine of God. Who is God? What's God's intentions with the world? And I think, just to throw in something else, and I think this is really important to say, is that for a large part of the evangelical world actually operates on half a gospel, okay? And what I mean with that is that if we have creation, fall, redemption, restoration as a schema of looking at of sort of overall biblical theology, they're really just working with fall and redemption, right? It's a half gospel. In other words, what's the greatest problem we have to deal with? Well, we need conversions and we need conversionism. But that's actually half the gospel. That's half the biblical story that starts with a creation and then the restoration of a creation, or a renewal of the image of God in the everlasting man, in Jesus, the last Adam. And so we miss out on a massive, massive part of the gospel in the way we speak about things. And at CROWSE, if you had to ask me what is our main, what is the, you know, all missions and all people who run enterprises have to have one sort of mission statement, you know. Normally it is to know Christ and to make him known, or something like that. Nobody has the copyright on that one anymore, because there'd be such a dispute. Every Christian organization would have to fight for it, you know. So it depends who's got the money and the better lawyers, of course, to get
well, something about Paul and dragging people to court, and you will be judging angels, and you shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah, but what we found very formative is, and I say we because what CROWSE is really is, it's not really an institution or an organization. It's really a collective of people, and my job is really just to see that other people flourish in the midst of it. I mean, that's what we do. But all of us somehow found ourselves rallying around Hans Rookmaaker's famous statement. And of course, Hans Rookmaaker was a church historian, an art historian. Sort of under Kuyper, and also a good friend of Labrie and Francis Schaeffer. And he said that Jesus did not come to make us Christians. He came to make us human. And so now that I've said all the other things that I've said, now you can begin to see why that statement is important to us. Because it's not just that we don't want people just to get half a gospel. We want them to start beginning to embrace the full gospel, right? And that's sounds so cliched, the full gospel. This is a full gospel church. Okay, but I mean, it's part of our mandate then to embrace all the domains of human living as part of the domain of redemption for God. Yeah.
JP, you want to follow on to that?
Yes. Well, yeah. I mean, this just made me think of Kuyper again. That well-known statement that we were speaking about a little bit earlier as well. That there's not a square inch of all of creation about which Christ does not rightfully say, "This is mine."
Yeah.
And yeah. So I guess what you it also resonated with what you were saying earlier about the university context and bringing all of the disciplines under the lordship of Christ and thinking through what does it mean for me as a believer to follow Christ in this particular domain.
Right.
What are the unique challenges, and particularly how do I bring the gospel to bear in that particular area? What does following Christ mean?
Yeah. Yeah, often that particular discussion falls under what has become to be known marketplace ministry. So, I mean, I studied at Regent in Canada, where you have where the basic intent is the priesthood of all believers. In other words, it's not just good for theologians to know the gospel, it's good for everybody to come to know the gospel. And then they established all these things. They were the first ones to have a department of spirituality, to have a department of Christian aesthetics, a program in imagination and the arts, and then the program for marketplace ministry. But of course, it's more than marketplace ministry, because it's not really the marketplace. It's really the vocation or the human enterprise, and so I wouldn't say, if you were to ask me, okay, so what do we do in relation to that? The answer is, I actually do very little, other than what we do is we have a dialogue with one another. So in people come and we would often have doctoral students come and do a presentation of what they're doing, and then give them the opportunity to explain as a Christian why this matters to them and why they're doing it. And then the conversation really starts flowing around, often, what are the distinctives of your particular discipline? What are the presuppositions of your discipline? Say sociology. What does your sociology professor say about anthropology, for example, or about human history? Okay, so how did we arrive at this particular point? And then not to reduce that to basic, simple biblical categories, but to really have a deep discussion around what that would mean. Like, now, you guys are mostly engineers. Like, you're irredeemable. I mean, because what can we say to engineers? Because they... No, I'm kidding. I mean, engineering, in terms of problem solving, in that which allows for human flourishing in every domain of structure and things that work for humanity, what a critical area. But not devoid of ethical and meaning questions at any juncture. Even though engineers tend to think they can skip that difficult question, it remains, right? It hovers. And I actually find engineers fascinating people, because what I found with engineers is that the way that they approach the problems that are theirs in terms of their discipline gives them there's such a practical sense of satisfaction in terms of solving problems, that it gives their minds freedom to think about all sorts of other philosophical and metaphysical questions. I mean, engineers are absolutely fascinating people, and then they bring the skills that they've gained into this sort of abstract domain, and they're actually really good at it. So in my experience, engineers make great theologians.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know much about like other departments, but from what I hear, it's nice to be an engineer. Just like there's a degree to it, you're insulated from like just all the postmodernism and all the nonsense. Because like you sit there with your supervisor and you do your master's or your PhD, and it has to work in the real world. And so the real world is a bit binding, and it has, you can't just make up something and live in your imagination. And
unless you start throwing difficult words at your professor, like epistemology or some other analogy.
They don't like
analogy of being. Then they
don't like it.
They don't like that kind of language.
I think that ethical question as well, which you just raised, is an interesting one. I think often in that space, these big tech companies and so on often have the attitude of, if we can do it, then we must do it.
Yes.
Or there's not questions. And I think lots of those things are coming home to roost.
Yes.
With the big tech companies now, governments are asking, privacy, all these big issues, because of human nature that's going to exploit this technology.
Absolutely.
We need to be thinking all along.
Yeah. And technology is a cultural enterprise, you know, and it's probably the most cultural enterprise because, and Andy Croutch is really good at showing this to you. Say the way that you change culture is by introducing something into culture. Culture only changes when you put something there that was not there before, right? And that's been a great lesson for me because, I mean, even in terms of what we're doing as a ministry, we had to, in a sense, put something there that's not been there before. And with that comes a great process of resistance and people who can cope with it. And it takes a long time before it's accepted in culture. But when you introduce something into culture, it changes everything. You just look at and it's changing at such an accelerated fashion that it's really worrying. And the ethics, as you rightly pointed out, it just seems that ethically we are not up to speed with the things that we do.
And it's like almost like a backlog of conversations that need to happen.
It's exactly right. Yeah, it's exactly right. You get that sense of anxiety. Wait a minute, we haven't talked about this. It's a little bit like giving your 12-year-old a cell phone, and because you know. It's there, and all his friends has it. You know, they all have it, and so he's got to have it in order to talk to them. And then suddenly, you realize, oh my goodness, this technology can do a whole lot of other things, and we haven't had a conversation about this. And then you suddenly pull back on that. Wait a minute, give me that thing back. Let's talk about. What does this thing do? You know, what can it make you do? What is it? What does it change in culture? And boy, does it change things. And so we need to be super, super careful. I mean, we don't need to be Luddites, and we don't need to be scared of it, but we do need to do the hard work of looking at what changes these things bring about. And we now live in a time where we already know the consequences of some of this technology. I mean, the studies are out there, the research is out there, but yet we resist it. And that's another question to ask. Why is it that we would seek this comfort, this sense of leisure over and above doing the hard things, that not allowing this particular technology to enter? Why would we, why are we allowing it?
Well, I think there's also often a lot of hope invested in technology. I mean, especially in the secular world, there's a kind of technocracy, that technology that's going to solve all of our problems.
That's right.
Artificial intelligence is going to give us the singularity. And there's a lot of hope invested in it as well. And I think our task in some ways as Christians as well is to try to challenge that hope. And show this ambivalent nature of technology as well. It can't be the ultimate
Exactly.
savior.
And we need really smart Christians at the forefront of this stuff who in a sense are early adopters of this technology, but then also early criticizers of the technology. I mean, I'd hate to use examples, but we're staring at a world that's going to roll out 5G in no time. Without being a conspiracy theorist, you're going to have to ask yourself, have we really done the research on the consequences of that? I mean, just aesthetically. And imagine in our neighborhood, suddenly we don't have this big tower that ironically they put up in a school ground, where suddenly you'll be surrounded by antennas, So, and so when you introduce all these technologies, you also have people who then become technology averse, and that has different kinds of fallout. So, this question of technology and how technology works alongside worldviews is a far deeper question for Christians around issues of powers and principalities. And there have been writers from the 80s, people like Jacques Ellul in France, who've been really on top of this stuff and saying, wait a minute, what we're looking at is not merely the introduction of a new artifact that can make things more convenient or comfortable for us. But what you're doing is you're changing culture. How is it changing culture? And how is that changing us as human beings? So.
No, but there is a real sense, without being a conspiracy theorist, there's a real sense in which we're not on it, if that makes sense. Like there is a real backlog. And I don't study in biology, but I listen to what people are talking about in the field, and they'll talk about CRISPR technology and engineering the genome, and in the womb they can choose genetic traits and stuff like that. And you just think like, man, we have not even figured out this government involvement with curating information, and now you want to start genetically engineering humans in the womb.
Yeah, no, it's right. I mean, when we were at Regent College in the mid-90s, they already had appointed, I think for almost a decade, people in bioethics, people in medical ethics. So they were on it from the beginning. They realized where the stuff was going, just in terms of who we are as human beings. And I think, ironically, as we go along, the really deep questions are always anthropological, right? Who are we as human beings? What are we made for? What gives us dignity, and how does that then fit in with the larger world? And so one of my little predictions is that ongoing deep work in the area of human anthropology for Christians is going to be a really, really important thing to deal with.
The difficulty is definitely the secular culture. So, like you mentioned, there is that haunting of the transcendent. So you have all these people that gather together believing that they're a major accident and they're not purposed, gathering together as a body and deciding what's ethical or not about engineering people. And they don't see the dissonance in their worldview at all. And I mean, and it's also touching on that same point with the hope that you mentioned that drives them. There's a real sense in which, the death problem itself one day will be cured by technology when we get there, so this gospel, there's a resurrection. Why is that needed when we have technology?
Yeah, it's more true than you realize. I mean, our context here in South Africa is, we are actually so blessed in so many ways. We don't tend to think along those lines, but
too busy complaining.
We're too busy complaining about other things, but just the fact that the power goes off every now and then is a bit of a blessing, I suppose. But what you've just mentioned, both in terms of technology wanting to solve the world, when we lived in Canada, one of the things that really took me by surprise was the way people struggled with death.
I can imagine.
In spite of the easy, laissez-faire way they dealt with death in terms of the unseen or the unborn and so on, and when it came to dealing with the death of someone in a community, it's a huge thing, and there's a real deep existential crisis around that, and that actually is very interesting. Why is it like that? And where's the hope? And the hope of a technology in relation to that.
I even think in the COVID crisis, I think this fear of death has also shaped the culture significantly. This insistence that so many people should not be dying, and unwillingness to look at how many people die usually, which we're completely unaware of. There are people dying around us all the time. That's the denial of death. You come back to that. We don't want to face up to that reality that we are dying. Yeah,
I think the really key questions, I think the really bad decisions made during this COVID crisis by church leaders are all around that particular question. And just to typify the kind of what is the overt message? What is the, if you had to say, what's the key message that the church gave to its congregations through its leadership in a time like this? And you would to compare that with the time of the churches. I'm just reading Stark's book of the Rise of Christianity, and you look at the way that the early church functioned in relation to the crises of the day. There's like Antioch, a city, every 15 years it was basically destroyed either through fire or pandemic or by enemies or whatever, and your life expectancy for a lot of men was around 30, so you're just living in a very radically different world. Or even like someone like Luther said, it's not that there's death in the midst of life, there's life in the midst of death, so a reappropriation of reality, right? So I think the first task of a Christian leader is to define reality, and I think, to be very blunt, I think a lot of Christian leadership has failed in this time to define reality in relation to this so-called pandemic. But let's not talk more about that. We could get into trouble for that.
But how should Christians go about culture making? Obviously, that's a very hyper-contextual question.
Yes,
but if you had to give some guiding principles.
I don't think I can really give very many guiding principles. I think the first thing to realize is that Christians are engaged in culture making. You're inevitably engaged in it, or at least taking on board culture that is being made around you. So I think the first thing to know is to be discerning around that. And I think it's also to understand what is a distinctly, if there is such a thing as a Christian culture, how is it shaped? And I think these are really important questions. And I think what we need with that is often churches talk about our vision, and their vision are often to transform culture or to shape a new culture. But I think vision is shockingly overrated. I think we need to go back to promise, and when we go back to promise, we go back to the biblical narrative. And when we go back to the biblical narrative, we begin to see that God has actually been acting and continues to act, and that our acts as a church, our expressions of a church as Christians, is in accordance with the great acts that He's already done. If you look at of the work of someone like James K. A. Smith, he'd say, how would you go about transforming Christian culture? Well, you start with the key components in the church, the family, and the church as a community. And you ask yourself, are these things that we are doing, are they actually in accordance with the promises and the story, the narrative of God with the world? So it's a very basic question, but it's hugely, it has massive effect in your life. So what does it mean for your daily family living? What does it mean in terms of the way you bring up your children? What does it mean for your conversations around the home? What does it mean for the church when they meet together in terms of what the church habitates, the culture that it creates by meeting together? And I think when we just do a simple little analyses like that, or a little audit of how much we are as a Christian community, with both in the home and in the church family, shaping our lives around the liturgy of the church. And what I mean with the liturgy church are the historical habits of the church throughout the two testaments and then into church history. Are we acting in accordance with that? And I mean, this is sort of a slightly philosophical answer, but it's a very practical answer, because it determines what we do in our homes and what we do in our church gatherings is actually deeply significant.
Yeah, I'm reminded of Moses instructing the Israelites. You will do this every year, and when your children ask you, why are we doing this?
Exactly.
So you will say to them.
Exactly. Yeah, and so I mean, a lot of people are writing at the moment about how to change culture. I'm thinking of someone like Rob Dreher, and his recent he's an Orthodox Christian, but he writes particularly in the North American context and the things that are happening around us. Culture is going berserk at the moment. I mean, we live in a moment of flashpoint of culture. And he wrote a very significant book, or a very influential book, a few years ago, called The Benedictine Option. Okay, so in other words, that the church should, at a time like this, a little bit like in church history when the world was overrun by barbarians, and like the Irish, withdraw to tiny little monasteries. He seems to suggest that kind of idea, withdraw into a monastery. The church should withdraw from the world in order to save culture for the future. This is his sort of preservation suggestion. But of course, it's not really what he's not really suggesting that. He's just saying that the church should step away from its own modernistic aspirations as an institution to change the world in politics or public theology, but the church should focus again exactly on the kind of things that we've said in what he calls the mediating structures. You begin to, I spoke to another prominent Christian thinker in the world, influential guy, and I said to him, how are you feeling with your church? He said, I'm very disillusioned with my church. I wish I could go back to the parish model. So here was a guy articulating instinctively the kind of things that are happening in culture. So he has a sense, well, it's time for the church to get back to first principles. What do we do in our families? What do we do in our home? And then how do we influence the local school or the local, what is the local social society? I mean, how do we impact things like that? And then we in other words, we jettison these great ambitions of we'll bring the kingdom of God to. I mean, these things are all above our pay grade. They're just not the things that we're able to do.
I think as you were speaking there, just remind me, I know J.R. Packer, your former teacher, he has quite a big emphasis on catechism, the historic way of teaching children.
That's right.
Basic way of just getting those truths, those stories into their minds, that form the material which in later years they can reflect on and inhabit those stories. Yeah.
I think we need to embrace liturgies for life. And of course, the word liturgy comes from the Greek latreia, how we worship. And worship in the church is shaped around everything we do in the church. And it's interesting in North America, in the very secular context of Western Canada where we lived, there was a real growing desire for young people to go to very traditional, either Catholic or Anglican or Orthodox churches. Why? Why would they do that? Because instinctively they realize that the culture has been emptied out of emptied of the transcendent, and they go back to these ancient things where they realize, oh, here's something that's come a long way in history. It has a shape that is shaped by. Sorry, I keep on knocking this mic. You'll have to edit that out. But they have these churches have a whole liturgy that's shaped around a story and narrative that has survived for a very long time. And if you look at North America right now, some of the key thinkers, and I think particularly amongst the women who are influential, is that a lot of them are actually evangelical Catholics. Now, that is a crisis for many people, a contradiction in terms for many people, but it not necessarily, right? You need to go re-examine that perhaps a little bit. But this sense of, well, we're part of a community that's come for a long time. And that in itself is also one of those Christ and culture options again. How do we preserve the faith, and how do we then continue into the future? So the more you talk about this, the more you realize how significant is this Christ and culture picture and how it actually shapes what we do in the church, the decisions we make. What are we going to do? Are we going to do this activity for this reason, or are we going to do something that actually seems odd to our culture? Shall we say the Apostles' Creed, for example? Why would we do that? How are people going to react to that? And so on. And so all those things are culture-making acts, reintroducing something that we've lost maybe for a long time.
No, I think that's a good point. So especially when people are brought up with maybe traditions or things that they do of that nature, and they don't understand kind of the substance of it. And so the substance has been ripped out, or the culture becomes secular, and so they rip the substance out. But now you have these structures still standing, and people aren't sure really why it's there. But they're so desperate for meaning and to combat nihilism that they, okay, maybe we should rediscover why is this thing here again.
Exactly. And I mean, of course, the great advantage of going to a very, like Don Carson called Vancouver the most secular city in the world. Yeesh. And to go live in a culture like that and then to come back to South Africa, it was very frustrating for us, to be honest. I mean, I sort of came back into a church setting where I was like, guys, I've got some stuff to tell you. I've seen the future. We should talk about this,
Because South Africa is also becoming more and more secular.
Well, inevitably. I mean, we're a very different country, but the question is the current church culture or the current church subculture, will it withstand what is thrown at it, right? And why are we doing certain things? And increasingly, we're going to have a group of people who are going to be very disillusioned with church, right? They're not going to find the things that they need there, and people are going to say, but we did everything for you. We accommodated you culturally in every way. No, well, yes, you gave up. You gave up the good. You gave up what you shouldn't have given up in order to accommodate these things. And so I do think there's a little bit more of the world in the church than the church than the church realizes. And sometimes there's more church in the world than what the church realizes. So
I think it's very true. Like people will go to church, and then over time they realize, look, I'm getting the same thing here that I get if I watch some Netflix series. It's the same. There's no gospel.
And I mean, if you just take something, the churches, for example, that have closed, just one illustration from this COVID pandemic. If you look at the churches in the East, most of those churches refused to close down because they felt that what is critical in terms of their gathering, for example, would be communion or the Eucharist, right? And they felt that's a vibrant part, that's a key part of our theological understanding of who we are as the church through the ages. And I look at the evangelical churches in the West that gave it up like that. And I don't know where you guys are, but it's possible that a whole lot of Christians in this town haven't had communion for more than 6 months. Does it bother us? No. Does it bother Christians in other parts of the world? Yes, very deeply. So how does this work? And what have we kind of just given up without even thinking about it? So I think this is a time, as a result, when we come out the other end of this, that the church is going to be reshaped by this, definitely.
So I mean, do you perhaps want to reflect more on the question of secularism in South Africa and how we should think about that?
I think the question of secularism for us in South Africa is very different from the question of secularism means something very different here than it does in for example, West Coast Canada or Seattle, or Europe for that matter. And I think that's important. I think we all see secularism as an increasingly age of threat. And so if you read someone like James K. Smith's book, How Not to Be Secular, which is just a summary of the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor's book, The Secular Age, which is a very significant piece of literature, by the way. Taylor defines the word secular in at least 3 different ways, or he has a particular meaning for it, and it's not a meaning we use in South Africa. And it might be helpful just to sketch that in a nutshell. Classically, the word secular, secularis, was the Latin translation of the world. The word in the New Testament say not of the world, and it stands in opposition to the word sacred. So a priest would be involved in sacred activities, but a baker and a candlestick maker, or whatever, as the classic saying goes, would be involved in something which is a secular activity. And that's the way it's classically been defined. That's sort of the traditional view of it, and then that's the language that grows. That in itself could be challenged, as I don't really think there are the oppositional realities. And what that also produces for us is a dualism in culture. There's a lot to talk about that there. Let's hold back on that. But then increasingly the word secular has come to mean that which is a neutral space. Yeah. And I think this is a great fallacy. In other words, you say we won't have prayer in school anymore, or when you come to this particular meeting in the public hall or a town hall, or when we make certain architectural or town planning decisions, leave your religion at the door, right? Because this is a neutral space, this is a secular space. And then what comes with that is this great program of secularism. In other words, where you basically ask the faith and all religions, by the way, to vacate the public domain. Let's get all religions out of the public domain. And sometimes we think when we read the Bible, that's the world we inhabit. Okay, and for us, there's a great tension. Oh, my kid, they're not doing prayer at the assembly anymore, and people get really upset about it and so on. And sometimes we read that back into the Bible. We say, okay, well, Paul enters into a kind of a secular space. Of course, it's not. It's a multi-faith or a pluralistic setting. And that's sort of the second use of secular, and that gets a lot of us at kind of the hair on the back of your neck starts standing up, and you see that kind of thing. But of course, it's a fallacy. And in the West, increasingly people will run, and have been running as for decades now, the myth of a secular age. So that was sort of a dream within the post-Enlightenment world, that we move increasingly into a secular age, as if we're going to vacate the public square of all this childish type things. And you see it in people like Dawkins and so on, but it's really not well thought through at all. Okay, and so even the BBC will run a whole series on the myth of the secular. In other words, it's not true. It's not possible for humans not to have worldview values which have metaphysical, implications. Yeah. Okay. So you cannot leave religion out of you. You need a different model, right? And so, unfortunately, in South Africa, we still increasingly think that it's possible to have a secular space. It's not possible, and so. In Canada, people don't actually think that way. They know that and postmodernism will enlighten the fact to everybody that everyone has a presupposition. You have a presupposition, you have your bias that you bring, right? And so there's a domain of discussion, but Charles Taylor uses the word secular in a third way, and he basically calls it a world in which whatever changes has come about, it has now become possible to live as if God does not exist. In other words, it's a different domain in which you live in what he calls an immanent frame. It's really this frame in which all the transcendent has been moved out of the box entirely. And it's possible to live as if God does not exist. Now, for a South African, that makes absolutely no sense because you don't have the mental categories to deal with it. But if you live in Canada, it takes you in Western Canada, in the city, it's not like that, of course, everywhere. But if you live in that kind of space, you increasingly begin to you realize that you live in a domain where people have absolute incuriosity towards religion, and particularly Christianity, which they view as the culprit. In other words, what has happened is that there's all this progressive ideas where the second meaning of secularism has moved. It's like varnishing a plank over and over again. It's like layers and layers, like it's like chipboard, you put that layer, that marine ply, you put layers on it, and you realize that these people are absolutely immune to ideas of the transcendent. Yet it haunts them, right? It's in their stories.
Binding.
It's binding. It's in their habits, and so they live in. They're not porous as human beings. This is all terminology used by Charles Taylor, and he says it's sort of the buffer itself. You're couched. You've got cushions all around you. When religion comes at you, there's lots of barriers it has to come through. But of course, you're also living in a cross-pressured space, in the sense that there are lots of ideas of the haunting of the transcendent and lots of habits that come over from religious precursors. And so that's a very difficult thing for North Americans to deal with. And you've got a whole lot of leadership centers talking about, just read a book this week by a guy called, I think, Bolsinger, called Canoeing the Mountain. And the title is apt, how is the church going to survive in this kind of secular space where you're not just fighting about public institutions and religion in it, but where you actually, your culture as a whole, your individualist culture has assumed that kind of situation. That's a very difficult thing. And that's going to come our way increasingly. And if you move overseas, you're going to encounter that. It's a very difficult thing. In other words, you use words, but you don't attach the same meaning to it. You have a whole lot of vocabulary that you share, but actually the referent to the word that you use is not quite there. And it makes it a very, very difficult space to inhabit. And the crisis for most of us is that we begin to describe it as a post-Christian, as a post-Christian era, or post-Christianity. I think we need to move away from the terminology. We need to move deeper into what Charles Taylor calls secularism in the third sense. That's that cross-pressured space where there's all this haunting of the transcendent and all these religious notions that have other expressions. People are always religious, right? They will always worship something. They will always express something. But now it's complex and it's multifaceted. And we need to begin to recognize that, I think, increasingly as a pre-Christian age rather than a post-Christian age.
Yeah, a lot of the guys that kind of comment on the culture, I've heard them say things like, we are rapidly moving from a post-Christian societies to anti-Christian societies.
Oh, yeah.
That they look, for example, in the States now, there's the whole confirmation thing with the new judge. And they would ask a question specifically about her faith because they know that she's Catholic, with the idea that they are pretending like they're being neutral, and they know that she in her private life, she's Catholic, and how much of that is she going to bring to the Supreme Court? And so there's that kind of tension and in terms of like values that she brings to the tables.
And she's not just any ordinary Catholic. She's a evangelical tongue-speaking Catholic with 7 kids, right? And a PhD and a professor and a judge. She's an extraordinary woman. Like, how much more extraordinary can you be? And and they will try and push back on that stuff. I think the problem with the negative narrative is, in terms of post-Christianity, is that, first of all, it's inaccurate. Okay, we never live in a Christian. There is no such thing as a Christian era. Again, I think that's above our pay grade. To even think that we live in a so-called Christian. We have lived in eras of Christendom. But we're always pre-Christian. Every generation is pre-Christian. In other words, and God, by the working of His Spirit among us, has been able to continue holding the church throughout all these cultural changes of massive proportions. And I think He will continue to do that, right? So, I think we need to change our mindset. Otherwise, we're going to become very, very depressed.
Why would you say is the reason that people have this conception that there is such a thing as neutral ground? And that's something, I don't know if they see it, but as a Christian, it's something that I can't help but notice because my worldview is so opposed to the culture. But I'll see people, they'll when they ask her questions, for example, like the one senator, is a very famous line that keeps getting quoted where she said, the dogma lives strong in you. And I'm just watching this and I'm thinking like, and you don't have any dogma? You're completely immune to these, you're so much floating above us,
Yeah, no, I think we need to just be able to point that out, because people, and Schaeffer was very good at this. So Schaeffer basically said the way that you interact with any worldview is by uncovering its presuppositions. Now, in most cases, in our case, in our situation, if people aren't surprisingly pro-Christian, they are surprisingly against, But again, as we said, what is an atheist? Is someone who knows exactly which God they don't want to believe in. So you expose your presuppositions at that point. But then they believe in other things, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just need to interrogate, their views on justice, or why should we care about the poor, and try and interrogate out of what worldview are those moral convictions coming from.
Yeah, for sure. So you need to. But what is interesting is that there is definitely in the way we are living in troubled times for the West, okay, or what is traditionally the West, and we know that. I mean. So there's an incredible bias against Christianity, and there is increasingly an unevenness with the way people will deal with this. So for example, in Canada, you won't have any Christian holidays per se, but Muslims will have a whole month in which they can practice certain things, and the government won't say anything about that. So it also depends, so the bias is clearly against historical Christianity. So it's really hard if you are a Christian and you enter into that environment. You've faced a lot of opposition, right? Now, some Christians revel in that. They're like, oh yeah, I'm confronting the world, but it's really not very pleasant, I mean, in our case, it took, for example, the local filling station on the island that we lived, it took the lady 3 years to say hello to us. Literally, she ignored us for 3 years, ignored me for 3 years. And in our case, the fact that I was the pastor of a Protestant church with fairly conservative theology, I was deemed to be an evil person. I mean, you encounter people and they're not even neutrally disposed to you. They've actually got a bias against you. So ironically, you're viewed as the immoral person in this setting. That's really challenging. It's very hard to live in that setting. It's very, very wearisome for pastors in that setting. So, for example, in Western Canada, almost 50% of people are what they call nuns and duns. In other words, they've done with Christianity or they have no Christianity. That's a very high percentage, or any religion for that matter. That's a very high percentage, because if you look at the surveys in this country and many countries in the world, even though people may not be evangelical or a particular kind of Christian, there is still a large percentage of people who would say that who would tick a box in religion. In Canada, most people say I'm spiritual but not religious. But of course, what does spiritual mean? And it's very significant for people to be able to say I am spiritual. Well, what is a spiritual person? And so, there's always that's so typical. You're spiritual but not religious. Well, that's a great conversation, right?
Yeah. No, that unexpected kind of hostility makes me think of like the early Christians and the Jews that were labeled as atheoi, like atheists by the Romans, because they're not buying into it. It's so unexpected.
Yeah, you're the evil people because you want to save the death of a baby, of an unborn child. You're the evil one. You're standing against something else. And so we really need to understand what are these structures of belief and how are they shaped. For example, you can say to a young person, who's very tense about, say, an issue of sensitive about race, and you can say, well, why is it sensitive about race? And they will say, well, because race is sacred. My race is sacred. You can't attack my race. And then you could immediately say, but why is gender not sacred if race is sacred? Okay, because you've got the same givenness there. You're born either male or female as you're born either Hispanic or Chinese or whatever. So there's a certain givenness about that, So why is the one sacred and not the other? And so we actually really it's not like we need to be super intelligent. I mean, you just need to be able to have a dialogue and ask honest questions.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. So like maybe the average Christian listening to this, listen to all this doom and gloom and secularism and opposition. And like what hope would you say is there for them kind of in the gospel, even in the secular age?
Yeah, I mean, I think Christ said he will build his church, and he has done that. It's so funny. I've been reading quite a bit of this literature recently, and then I picked up Lesslie Newbigin's The Gospel in a Pluralist Society again, and I was so struck by this Anglican bishop who had spent all his life in India, working in that multi-faith setting where conversion is so few and far between, and then coming back, but yet somehow gaining such confidence in the gospel, and then coming back into England in his retirement, and then just being astonished by the way Christians in the West have given up hope in the gospel. So we cannot give up hope in the gospel, because I mean, here we are, and the Lord has saved us, and he will continue to do what he will do, and we will be, even as we are surprised by the sudden changes in Western history just in the last 2 years, or maybe the last decade. The changes have been so rapid. In the same way, I think we can expect God to bring about changes in societies where you would say, I would never have spoken the word of Jesus in that society for fear of being decapitated or whatever, and then suddenly finding that there's such a hunger in that society for Jesus. So, and the other interesting thing is that we live in a time where truth is really in short supply. I mean, you really look at all these conspiracy theories alone that's flying around. You go like, man, if someone could just speak the truth for a change, What is the truth about masks? I mean, like, you could pick your own version of it, So we live in this social media.
I like the one where if I wear it on my chin, then it's sufficient.
Yeah, we live in this social media soup where there are all these versions of truth, and there's this, and then we live in this sense in which there are a lot of people who have been meddling in darkness for ages and ages, and then suddenly the truth comes out. And so there's this, I have this sense of, man, there's truth out there, and the truth will be exposed. In the same way, we're going to suddenly find out about Bill Gates or whatever. I'm just joking. We find out truths about people. Joe Biden. Shall I throw out a few more? You'll have to censor this. But we suddenly find out truth about people, and you go like, wow, what a relief. We'd kind of suspected something. And the same way that we feel the gospel is under pressure, we know that it is true. We know that it is oppressed. We know that it is suppressed. But at some point, the ball in the pool flips over, and you see the red top side and the blue at the bottom. That's a terrible illustration. Do you know what I mean?
What I thought of about the truth shining out is that Gerard Manley Hopkins poem, which I know that you love, that the world is charged with the grandeur of God, and it will flame out.
Yeah, exactly.
That confidence, that you can't suppress the truth.
Yeah.
As much as people suppress the truth, God's glory will ultimately prevail.
I think as a Calvinist, there's sometimes that tension between, like, you kind of understand how depraved the world is. You're like, no, there's no hope. But then at the same time, you consider your salvation. And you're like, somehow God did. Somehow he was capable of saving this depraved guy. And so, yeah.
No, absolutely true. Yeah. And I mean, the truth is so liberating, isn't it? It's so liberating. And I think we live in a world in which is so much bondage.
Yeah.
Increasingly bondage. So very liberating.
Yeah, but thanks, JB. I don't know, JP, if you had anything else.
No. Just thank you very much.
Okay.
Interesting conversation.
I hope it makes sense to somebody out there.
No, I think it was fascinating. It's a lot to think about, processing kind of the assumptions that we operate on, again, as we approach the world with our Christian faith, and we seek to live it out to Christ's glory. And thank you for your time. It's been very enlightening.
My pleasure. Thank you for asking me.